Issei Sagawa was a man born in Kobe, Japan, a scholar of comparative literature. A minor celebrity in Japan, he found a career in writing manga novels and appearing on talk shows. Doesn't sound familiar? Well, many know him by a different name, the Kobe Cannibal. Even worse than this, Sagawa is known as the killer who walked free. Issei had cannibalistic urges for as long as he could remember, infatuated by the idea of consuming human flesh. He spent his entire childhood fantasizing about what it would be like to engage in an act that was so prohibited by society. He read stories like Hansel and Gretel and was engulfed in delight as his uncle pretended to make human stew out of him and his brother. He might not have known what was causing these desires in the beginning, but as he grew, he knew that cannibalism was not about enjoying a delicious forbidden meal, like the witch's candy house in the stories he read. No, this was much more bizarre than a gurgling in his stomach, something that a zombie wouldn't be able to ignore. Issei's obsession with cannibalism came from a sense of erotica. He would see women in Western culture and become totally overcome with desire to eat them. To him, eating humans was a kink, a fetish, a sexual desire that he couldn't let go of. After countless, endless sessions of therapy where he tried to find a reason, a way to stop the feelings he had inside, he couldn't take it anymore. He realized that he couldn't be helped, that no one could cure him of his perverted wants. 17 years would go by as Issei tried to battle his urges. He focused on his studies and tried as hard as he could to drown out the thoughts of carnage, eventually making it into a PhD program in Paris, France. He tried to release his feelings into his writings on the road to a degree in literature at Sorbonne University. When it seemed like all avenues of curing himself had failed, Issei decided it was time to do the deed. He needed to do it right, but how? As he pondered how to do what he had always desired, he realized that whoever he chose, they couldn't get out alive. He had to choose someone that he thought no one would miss, someone that was easy to lure into his apartment. Issei hired a prostitute to come home with him one night. His heart pounded with thunder as he planned what actions he would take. He had secured a firearm and rested it safely in his pocket, unassuming that he would ever be the type to carry such a dangerous weapon. He was a skinny guy, being described as having pencil legs and sported large, thick-framed glasses. There was nothing about him that seemed especially threatening, definitely not to the prostitute that he drove back to his apartment that night. His hands shook as they entered his apartment, trying to make some kind of small talk. All Issei could think about was how he would do it. When was the right time to pull out the gun? How swift would he need to be? As the prostitute went to the bathroom to wash up, the opportunity had presented itself. He removed the weapon from his pocket, holding it in his trembling hands. He tiptoed over to the woman he had just met, pointing it at her. She had no idea of what was occurring just a few feet behind her. As he reached to pull the trigger, ready to end his first life, Issei's pointer finger froze in place. He couldn't bring himself to release a single bullet. He would continue this same routine almost every night throughout his college experience, freezing in place every time. As he failed over and over again, Issei no longer had the desire to consume these women. He just had to bring himself to pull the trigger. It wasn't until Issei met his classmate, Renee Hartfelt, that he would see a brand new opportunity to live out what he had always wanted. As the two spent time together, they had become friends. Renee had no clue that every time Issei saw her face, he thought about what it would be like to take a bite. He had invited her over for dinner, ready to hatch his plan that had been decades in the making. Issei waited patiently for Renee's back to be turned and retrieved a rifle that he had been concealing. As he held it up behind her, he noticed that he was actually able to move his pointer finger. He reached for the trigger, pressing down with a gentle force, bracing for what was to come next. Click! The gun had jammed. Issei was engulfed in a complete rage. He didn't care about cannibalism anymore. He just knew her life needed to end. He had to carry out his plan if it was the last thing he did. On June 11th, 1981, Renee had come over for a study session with Issei. He had told her he needed help learning German, and she was happy to come to his aid. As the first order of business, Renee thought it might be a good idea to read to Issei in German, getting him used to how the language sounded. As she read a poetry book, Issei took his opportunity. He wouldn't fail this time. He couldn't. He took out the rifle, holding it up the same way he did hundreds of times before. As he rested his pointer finger on the trigger, he inhaled and exhaled slowly, attempting to jolt his finger into motion. His finger moved, and the trigger was pushed. The boom of a gunshot rang throughout the home. As Renee's neck had been hit with Issei's first bullet, Issei thought to himself that he had finally done it. He had finally completed the mission that he had been on since the day his finger froze. As blood pooled on the floor, Issei realized that he had actually completed the task. He became dizzy, his head feeling heavy as a boulder. He crashed to the floor, passing out from the reality of what he had done. When he awoke, he saw his friend lying on the floor, taking in that he had really ended her life. He snapped out of this thought rather quickly, however, as the realization set in that his childhood dreams were finally about to come true. After sexually assaulting the corpse of Renee, Issei would consume her body over the course of several days. Meanwhile, it had been several days since Renee's family had heard from her. It wasn't like her to leave them in the dark. They frantically talked to Renee's friends and classmates, and their hearts grew heavy as they learned that she hadn't been seen on campus for almost a week. Upon this news, the family knew that they had to call the police. 2 joggers ran their usual route along a lake at Bois de Boulogne Park. They took in the usual sights, but something was different this time. They noticed 2 large suitcases floating in the lake, suitcases that had blood leaking out of them. Taking no chances, the 2 immediately called the police. It didn't take long for the police to find Issei, and it took Issei even less time to confess. The investigation was open and shut, as they prepared to put Issei away for the gruesome, hair-raising acts that had been committed. Issei received a psychiatric evaluation before he could be tried for Renee's death, where they found that Issei was mentally insane. Whatever had happened, Issei was not mentally responsible for it. Renee's family shook in rage as they heard the news, citing back to a time where Issei was a successful PhD student. How could he possibly not know what he was doing? Though Issei couldn't be held responsible, he couldn't stay in France. He was swiftly deported back to Japan, where Renee's family promised they would make sure he would never walk the streets freely. Unfortunately, the family would be gravely disappointed and slighted from justice another time. Upon Issei's intake evaluation in Japan, it was determined that he was completely fine. There was no need for him to be under psychiatric care. However, due to the fact that Issei's charges had been dropped, it was impossible to try him again for Renee's murder. Not to mention the fact that any evidence that the French police obtained was sealed and unavailable to Japanese investigators. Issei simply checked himself out of the psychiatric hospital and walked freely. He participated in numerous interviews and gained a career writing about his bone-chilling desires, painting naked women, and appearing in pornographic films. Interviewers' hearts stopped as they heard him say he would easily do what he did to Renee again, lacking any kind of remorse for her passing. His only regret, according to his words in an interview, was that he couldn't eat her while she was alive. Issei Sagawa passed away from pneumonia in November of 2021, never having acted on his disturbing urges another time, although still fantasizing about his previous deeds. This is an absolutely insane case, and I want to know what you think. Did the criminal justice system fail Renee's family? How can we make sure this never happens again? Let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification to see more crazy stories, just like this one. Until next time.